Hello everyone and welcome to Saturn Returns with me, Caggie Dunlop. This is a podcast that aims to bring clarity during transitional times where there can be confusion and doubt. Over the years, building Saturn Returns has brought me so much joy, but I think the thing that I am most proud of is the community.
Hi, my name is Sophie, and I just finished the Saturn Returns course. I am a big fan of the podcast and the books. Just came out of my Saturn Return, had a ton of ideas sort of swirling around and wanted to get more clarity. So when the course came out, I bought it right away. I find a ton of value from journaling, but I don't always know what to write. So Caggie sort of guiding you through this 7-week or however long it takes you to do it, self-guided program was invaluable. I feel like I learned a ton about myself, and the meditations are incredible. The resources she recommends are incredible, and I will definitely be buying many more courses because I got so much value out of this one. So if you're considering it, I would say whether you're about to embark on your Saturn return, in the middle of it, just got out of it, there's definitely something in it for you. So for sure, give it a try.
We have this ability, if we love something hard enough, if we know something to be true, we will fight for it. And so my book is really an exploration that tries to get people to love life and their congruency and the flow of nature and all of that again, because then we will fight for it.
Today, I am joined by the powerhouse that is Sarah Wilson, a multi-New York Times and Amazon best-selling author, social philosopher, international keynote speaker, minimalist, and philanthropist. You might be familiar with Sarah's work because she founded the global movement I Quit Sugar. She was the editor of Cosmopolitan Australia at 29. She hosted the most watched TV series show in the nation's history, the first season of MasterChef Australia, and she wrote the bestseller First We Make the Beast Beautiful, which is a book all around living with anxiety. We grapple with the looming shadow of climate change. Sarah challenges us to rethink, reevaluate, and most importantly, to act. It's not just about policies and technologies, it's about values and mindset, and about redefining the narrative. So fasten your seatbelts as we embark on this very exciting journey with the one and only Sarah Wilson. Sarah, welcome to the Saturn Returns podcast.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Thank you for coming, because you've come from Paris, but you are originally Australian. I have a very strong connection to Australia. I've been there a couple of times and I absolutely love it.
Yeah, people think I'm mad to leave Australia to go and live in a big noisy city like Paris, but there's a bunch of reasons for it. Paris is actually a really great base for catching a train to all different parts of Europe to sort of, be part of the conversation that's happening in the world at the moment. So, and also it's a romantic city,
I've been a romantic city.
15 years single, and I go to Paris, and I think in the first 2 weeks I got asked out on 11 dates, and the men showed up. They showed up. They didn't ghost or do a no-show. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Do you think that they're more confident there?
Are we more wowing that the men showed up, or wow they don't elsewhere?
I was quite shocked that you actually said, they actually showed up. I was like, why wouldn't? Is that a thing that men wouldn't show up?
Yeah, it's a phenomenon. I think anyone who's single listening to this would probably go, oh yeah, that's just what happens.
But to ask someone out and then not go to the date?
Yeah.
But why?
You might have to ask all the men out there collectively.
Men?
I think it's part of dating culture. It's the whole app culture. It's, I think, a space that the world's in terms of being very avoidant. Yeah. And I think we're a generation, and I'm older than the generation I'm really talking about, but because I'm engaged in dating apps, I'm sort of embroiled in it all, who have grown up or are surrounded with technology that enables us not to connect, right? So, and I write about this in my latest book, how we do sort of the diet version of life. You know what I mean? So
what do you mean by that?
So instead of having sex, we watch porn. You know, instead of meeting in real life, we sit on apps and go backwards and forwards
online.
Exactly. And so we're doing the low calorie diet version instead of the full fat, nutritious, robust version of things. And so we're in that habit where we've lost the ability to know how to do, well, as I write in the book, go to the edge of life where the vibrancy happens, and we cocoon. And I think obviously the pandemic amped that up a bit, and there's a generation of young people who are not going out to get their driver's license because it's too scary. And it's one thing that you can't do with technology, right? Like you can't go and get your driver's license. You can't cheat it and do a fake version of it, right?
That's so fascinating.
Yeah.
So
anyway,
actually people aren't going and doing those things because they find it too daunting.
They've lost the habit, right? And it is scary. It's scary to turn up for a date. But we used to just do those things.
We had to.
There was no other way. Like when I was growing up, and this is giving away just how old I am, like somebody would have to get your phone number off you and write it with a pen and paper, and then and they'd have to meet you in real life to do that, and then they would have to ring a landline, and there was a really good chance your dad would pick up the phone, and you'd have to talk to this person's dad, and then you'd have to ask them out, and then you wouldn't have a phone where you can just sort of write a breezy, hey, I'm not going to be able to make it, babe, another time. You don't get that opportunity. You might only have one opportunity to get in touch with this person on a phone, and you've got to show up the following Tuesday at whatever cafe. And
also, if you're going to have the courage to go and speak to someone in the street, then
yes,
you're obviously going to want to meet up with them.
You've developed some resilience, and you've already invested, and then you've got to get excited about it. And then, there was more enrollment. There was the full fat version of life, the full nutritious, flavoursome version, and sadly, there's so much that we avoid and are able to avoid. And I say this in the book, technology isn't the problem. Technology only ever enables some of our worst behaviours,
Like anything, really.
Exactly.
It's how we use it. So I want to really get into all of this stuff and the book. But for our audience that doesn't know, would we be able to bring it right back to the beginning and how you got into the work that you do and where that journey kind of began for you?
Well, it probably began as a kid. I grew up in the country outside Canberra, which is the capital of Australia, and in the middle of nowhere. And it sounds very romantic. We had, goats for milk and meat, but it was in the middle of a drought. It was bleak, and mum and dad were just broke. They had no money. So, myself and my 5 siblings, we grew up out there, and it was it was a subsistence living existence. So very simple. We built everything, made everything, all of that kind of thing. So that probably explains a little bit about where I am today. But in between, it was a bit of a kind of an up and down journey. So I was a journalist. I worked for Rupert Murdoch, did my cadetship there. I was a restaurant reviewer, but I also had an opinion column. So I was this sort of token left-wing female voice, in one of the major newspapers. Off the back of that, I became the editor of Cosmopolitan Australia at 29, and then I went on to host MasterChef Australia. All of this happened by accident. I didn't apply for these jobs. In fact, I got the job as host of MasterChef on Christmas Eve. I got a phone call, and they said, "You're the new host of this new show that's going to start." And I'm like, "But I didn't apply for it." So I'd done some auditions, but it was kind of, they were auditioning all kinds of people, foodie type people, and they didn't really know what the format would be like. And I think that series did very well in the UK, and it changed the format. So they were experimenting with things. So that happened by accident. So I've done all these kinds of things in the commercial world, and then eventually I gave it all up, moved to an army shed in the forest, gave away all my belongings, and started playing around with my health. I developed this autoimmune disease that almost killed me when I was 34, which is why I quit media. First Cosmo, and then it was about 2 years later that I quit television, and I just had to heal. So I developed this program called I Quit Sugar, which was just my own exploration. Literally, I quit sugar, I gave it a go, and then I decided to share the information. Twitter had just been invented, so that gives another indication of how old I am. And so I started tweeting out these recipes and images of the food I was creating. And it turned into an ebook. which turned into a print book, and then I think it sells in 52 countries.
History.
Yeah.
So did you were already interested in food, obviously, but then with the health situation, did that then deepen that interest in nutrition?
I was literally doing it as a way. Well, actually, I was writing a column, like in a weekend newspaper insert, where each week I would do an experiment with my health because I was so unwell.
If you don't mind me asking, what was...
Oh, I had an autoimmune disease called Hashimoto's, which is a thyroid disease.
Okay.
But I'd run myself so far into the ground and left it untreated that I was, the doctors said that I was 2 weeks from heart failure. Like, I was really, really bad.
How old were you?
I was 34.
Wow.
Yeah. I was the worst case that the Prince of Wales Hospital in Australia had ever seen in terms of my blood levels and so on. So I was
But were you healthy in like what you were eating and everything like that?
Yes and no. I thought I was. I was a seductive sugar eater. So I was eating so-called healthy sugar. And so that obviously precipitated this journey to try to improve my health. So that's how that all happened. But yeah, so, and I gradually did heal myself, and then the business grew, and ... many years later, with 25 staff, I reached this point, and I don't know how familiar you are with this story. I write about it in this latest book. A couple of years ago, I sold everything off and shut everything down and gave everything to charity. So I gave all of my possessions and everything. And I've done this many times over, where I basically live, out of, for instance, the writing of my most recent book, This One Wild and Precious Life. I lived out of one carry-on bag, 15 kilos, for 3 years, and I hike around the world in the footsteps of philosophers and poets and scientists to try to find a through line through the climate crisis and everything that's going on. So, yeah, that's sort of the short version of everything that sort of has gone on for my career.
And what made you make that decision to go off on those journeys and give everything away and just be completely unattached?
Yeah, well, there's a particular sort of set of events. So when I built up the business I Quit Sugar, and it was really starting to gain momentum, and it became a digital program with staff and an office, and I was living on the road still. I was living around the world with my backpack on and off, and I lived that way for 10 years. For 3 years, it was very concentrated while I wrote This One Wild and Precious Life. But my accountant sat down with me and he said, right, Sarah, what are your goals, your financial goals? And I'm like, I don't do financial goals. I don't care. And he said, no, come on, just help me out here. Where do you want to be at in 5 years' time? Make something up. And he had a whiteboard with texters and everything. And I said, all right, in 5 years, I want to be at a stage where I've earned enough money to be able to live on the minimum wage till I'm, let's say, 94. And yeah, like that's what I would like. And he said, okay, and what would you do at the 5 year mark if that happened? I went, oh, well, I would give everything else away. Anything I earn on top of that, I'll just give it all away to charity so that I'm free to do projects which help humanity rather than just keep me on a treadmill. He said, okay, well, let's make that your financial goal. Anyway.
He must have been like, this is the first time anyone's come to me.
And it became a talking point. Like, he's an accountant as part of a big firm that looks after media people, right, in Australia. And so it became a talking point. Like, there's this mad woman who's,
super successful. And
And he was really supportive. He read books on all of this, on altruism and philanthropy and tried to... Anyway, 5 years to the week, he emails me and says, Sarah, you've hit your goal. I'm like, what goal? And he said, the 5 year mark. And I went, oh. And he said, so what do we do now? And I said, oh, we shut down the business and I give everything away. Now, it took a little over a year to do that because there's all these things you've got to do. But that's essentially what I did. And it was to remain, I suppose, authentic to where I was at when I made that commitment, which was in a space where I'd almost died. Mm-hmm. I came across this abundance, and I'd made a commitment when, there's a big story to this, but I was very suicidal as well at this time because I'd lost everything. Yeah, when I was sick. I'd lost everything. I couldn't walk for a year. I couldn't work. My hair fell out. I put on all this weight. I'd gone from being an editor of a big magazine and, sort of going to red carpet events to, unable to operate and living on my own and in isolation. And so at a certain juncture, I decided to live. And I write about this in another book, First We Make the Beast Beautiful, which is about anxiety and sort of a philosophical reframing of anxiety. When I decided to live, I went, right, I don't have to stay on the conveyor belt. I can actually choose to live life as I feel it should be lived, with just the clothes on my back. And that's the commitment I made. And I said to myself, I am going to have to put stakes in the ground to ensure I live that way, because it's very easy to get sucked back into the system.
Totally, yeah.
And so one of those things was to ensure that I don't live to the edicts and the mores of money. And so that was the commitment I made in line with that. And so that's why I stuck to the commitment, and I continue to stick to that commitment.
And how did that feel after those 5 years? Because obviously a lot changes in 5 years, and I think it's such a beautiful, inspiring story that you made that commitment and that you stuck to it. Because like you say, people get into things for the best of intentions, and then it builds, it becomes this business, it becomes this empire, and then it suddenly, there are all these other people around that have different motivations, and it then becomes something that it never intended to be. And it's really hard, I think, for people to kind of do anything different, but you did.
Yeah, I suppose I've always lived to those ideals. You know, obviously the way I grew up probably gave me some skills in living without an attachment to stuff. But I'd also learned that our attachment to things, consumption, etc., was very tied up with anxiety, dissatisfaction, loneliness, and all of that kind of thing. And I'd learned over the years that, you know, we know the studies, we hear all the studies about the hedonistic treadmill, and we listen to it, right? But none of us actually go, hey, let's get off the treadmill, running, right? And so I became very pragmatic, and it was partly because I'd come close to death, and it really gave me a jolt, you know? And so, yeah, and the more I do it, like, and again, you know, I write about this, I'm always kind of, I think you'd know this from writing a book, you know, when you write a book and then you talk about stuff from the book, you feel self-conscious that you're repeating yourself, but you're not really, because most people haven't read the book yet. So I write about this, that so much of what we do when we're caught up in this capitalist cycle makes us so miserable, you know? And I really got the opportunity to stand back and go, this makes no sense, you know? And I break it all down. And there's nothing like writing a book about this stuff to get you very conscious of the things that you've always felt to be inherently, intuitively true. So it's never been a sacrifice for me. Basically, when you live this way, it begets more of it. So when you don't shop and you discover the freedom of not having to make those decisions, because the decision-making part of the brain is intertwined with the anxious part of the brain. So when you're making just too many decisions, you get anxious. When you're anxious, you find it very hard to make decisions, right? Yeah. So if you want to actually reduce a huge amount of anxiety in your life, don't go to a shopping mall. That basically cuts out so much. And most panic attacks happen in shopping malls, and you can see why, right? So I find that if I don't shop, it actually begets more non-shopping and creates this huge amount of freedom and release, right? Space, like, it's just, that's not for me. I don't do that. You know, I walk around here in London and there's all these shops and everything. I'm like, I don't do that. That's just not what I do. Not interested.
Can we talk about the chapter in your life where you wrote the book on anxiety and what that, because I think for, you know, I know a lot of our listeners and generally people at the moment are struggling with anxiety, I feel, more than ever, and you'll know whether that's true more than I do. But what was that process like, writing that book?
Oh, it's super hard. So I was writing it at the same time I was doing the I Quit Sugar journey.
And how tied in was the quitting sugar to the anxiety?
Oh, very, very, yeah. People sort of go, you went from sugar to anxiety. I'm like, yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. But so the way that sugar, you know, interacts with our endocrinal system is very intertwined with the anxiety mechanism, et cetera, But I suppose it took me almost 7 years to write that book. Wow. But I interviewed literally hundreds, if not close to over 1,000 experts. And I went around the world to do that. So, you know, I interviewed His Holiness the Dalai Lama 3 times, Brene Brown. I hung out with Oprah's life coach and she mentally bent a spoon, like
in front of you.
Shit. Yeah, in front of me. I still don't know how that happened. I don't get it. But when I write a book, it's a massive journey. And
did you know the book was going to be around anxiety? Did you know?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I've got bipolar and I've got obsessive-compulsive disorder, and I've grappled with it all my life. And for anyone who has been medicated from a young age, you are always on a journey to work out, am I a problem? Is this a problem, or is there beauty to this? Hence the title of the book. So, yeah, I went around the world to basically investigate how creativity and anxiety is intertwined, and how the greatest inventions, the greatest progress that's been made, for humans has come about from people who have had to grapple with anxiety. And so I twist things around. And so if we could see this beast as a beautiful thing, then we can actually use it not only to survive, but to thrive. And it's only since 1980 that anxiety has been considered a disorder. So it entered the DSM, which informs the UK's mental health policies. It's a big sort of technical textbook that psychiatrists use to diagnose mental health conditions. Anxiety only entered the DSM in 1980. And what do you know? It was within 6 months of the first anti-anxiety medication being invented. So anyway, I'm not anti-medication at all. And in fact, I get all the big mental health organisations around the world to endorse the book and make sure it's a responsible book in line with medical practices. So I did that in the US, Australia and the UK. But so the anxious journey, you mentioned that people are more anxious than ever before. There's a few things going on there. First of all, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that our culture has lost the ability to work with and in and around anxiety. So we often get anxious about being anxious, and then we get anxious about being anxious about being anxious, and we go down this spiral, right? And I think that's what contemporary anxiety is for most people today, is this sense we're not meant to be anxious, right? And so we've medicalized it and we've stigmatized it to a point where we've lost our resilience around sitting in the shit of it all. Discomfort, exactly. So there's that piece. There's also the piece in around, I think, loneliness and the disconnection. And so that's what I explore in what is almost a part 2 to that book. So this One Wild and Precious Life really is about the disconnect we feel. And I opened the book by talking about loneliness. And initially it was going to be a book about loneliness.
Okay.
But it morphed into this sort of discussion about how disconnected we've become from life.
And how interconnected all the things in the book
Correct.
are.
Yeah.
Which seem like individually big themes that aren't interconnected, right?
Yeah, and I find the simple path through it all, because people are just going, I don't know where to start with all of this. I feel disempowered and so overwhelmed and anxious because it's real. I think everybody knows the climate is shifting and it's becoming perilous, right? But people go, well, what's my little, recycling habit going to do? It's not going to make a difference. And so people then put the duvet over their head and hope it all just goes away. And that's a really natural response. It's a very natural response. So anyone who's listening to this, who's feeling bad about their lack of action or their tendency to want to shut it all down, there's reasons for it, right? And it's evolutionary. And it's evolutionarily proven to be, something that is a very legitimate reaction. But what we've got to do is, we don't want to stay in that space, right? And it creates
putting our head in the sand.
Correct. And it creates what I call a moral aloneness. So the loneliness and the anxiety we feel today is not so much about when don't have enough contact with other people. We've got so much noise and contact and stuff going on. It's really because we're feeling a disconnect, a loneliness from ourselves and from the matrix of life, from the way that life is flowing. And so there's this incongruency, where we're not matching up with the way we know life flows, where
we're naturally supposed to be living.
That's it. And so that is just creating this dissonance for us. And so I think that's at the heart of a lot of our anxiety, and it's a lot at the heart of our reticence to engage in climate action, in saving our one wild and precious life, together here on this planet. So, we can keep buying things and we can keep trying to numb ourselves and we can keep addressing things from a whole range of angles. But essentially, you know, what I say in the book is we as humans are capable of the most wonderful, beautiful things when we love something hard enough. So, you know, you hear those stories of the 50-kilo mother who can lift a car off her child, you know, when it's rolled over her kid. We hear stories of these sporting matches, right, where the losing side is down a couple of points and the fans are starting to go home. Everyone's given up. The show's over. And out of nowhere, the losing side does this kind of kamikaze act. They throw all the rules and the tactics out the window and they come in with the home run or the goal or whatever it is. And there's probably way too many examples of that to really make sense, other than to say that it's an indication of how humans operate.
And we all possess that unexpected hero.
We do. Yeah. So we've got this. So when people lose hope, I just point to that we have this ability, if we love something hard enough, if we know something to be true, we will fight for it. And so my book is really an exploration that tries to get people to love life and their congruency and the flow of nature and all of that again, because then we will fight for it. And the big thing that I sort of point out is that it's not about self-flagellating or sacrificing too much or, you know, sort of being miserable. It really is quite the opposite. Like, my motto is, you know, this is not about restriction and horrible living. It's about making the new way of living sexier than the status quo. And that's when the shift will happen. And so I show different ways that living simply, living in congruency with nature, not being sucked in by the capitalist imperative, actually makes us so happy. You know, it's joyful, it's freedom.
You mentioned if we know something to be true, as if that's an obvious thing for a lot of people. And I fear that maybe it's not. I think that a lot of people don't really know what is true anymore, because we are bombarded by so much information that often has an ulterior motive. And like you say, it creates this sort of dichotomy where we're being told one thing, we might innately know another, but those two things are in conflict with each other. And I think that, like you said, creates this anxiety where you have an inner knowing, but the systems that govern you are telling you something very different.
And it's interesting, isn't it, when our reaction when that happens, we slip into the system. Yeah. Right? We just go shopping, you know, and we buy into that imperative of keeping the system going.
Well, I think it's more terrifying, or the idea of it feels more terrifying probably than the reality, to pierce that bubble, if you know what I mean.
Totally, because what's the alternative? Because we haven't been presented with sexier visions of the alternative. So, yeah, it's interesting. But I think that most people, if you sit down with them, as I do, and I did with big focus groups when I was writing the book, but also I've travelled the world now doing conversations about it and so on. Most people understand the insanity of thinking that we can continue to consume infinitely on a finite planet. It doesn't add up. Like, nobody is stupid enough to think that we can just keep going, right? We basically at the moment are consuming the equivalent of 7 planet Earths. How long do we think that can actually hold up for? And so when I say we know the truth, we know what's going on, I think most people know that. They know that it can't stack up and that this is unsustainable. Leave aside sustainability as an environmental word. I mean, it just can't hold. And it's not holding. We're all living on the planet today and we can see what's happening. And climate change isn't so much about change and a warming of the planet. And I think this is what happens in the UK because, you know, a slight warming in temperatures, particularly in summer, is greeted as a great thing. There's not as much engagement in the issue as it is, say, for instance, in Australia and parts of the States and parts of Southern Europe. But really what we need to do is see that this is not about climate change. Remember, these words were very much formulated by governments in the 1980s and 90s to get us a little bit numb to what was going on. Really what's happening. Well, there was, I think some of you might have listened to or seen the movie called Vice. It actually features the way that the wording, whether it was climate change or climate this or whatever, was workshopped, and such that the wording that makes us feel less threatened was the wording that was used. So it was, it's micromanaged.
Sinister. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the word is climate collapse. That's what's happening. So it's not going to be about just a warming in certain places. We're talking about sort of this climate wobbliness, and that's what we're seeing. So in the UK, it'll be flooding, it'll be a whole range of things, and it'll be food insecurity, which I think since Brexit, everyone's got a little bit of an indication of what that could look like. We've got topsoil that will probably last 20 years. We've got enough fossil fuels to last about 40 years before it becomes too expensive to extract. These things are running out. Yeah. And, nowhere on the planet is going to be immune. So it's not about climate warming. That's obviously a big part of it, but how we're going to experience it is in all kinds of ways. And we're seeing it. Floods.
Yeah, because we're exploiting
typhoons, hurricanes, all kinds of wobbliness.
When you say topsoil will last about, do you say 20 years?
Yeah, there's about 20 years worth of
what do you mean by
farming capacity.
Because of the way that we are
farming. Yeah. And it's a very unsustainable way of going about food production. We've raped and pillaged the land, and it's exhausted, and it can no longer produce viable food to feed the planet. So food insecurity is already really high, and it's going to increase. And it's going to increase in countries like Australia, the UK. UK will be very, very vulnerable because it relies on imports so heavily. So, we're not going to die from being burnt to a crisp from heat exhaustion. That's not going to be what is going to be the problem going forward. It's going to be mass civil unrest as a result of food scarcity, as a result of the haves and the have-nots, It's going to be a result of houses that can't be insured. So there's already huge parts of Australia, the US, also the UK, where homes can't be insured. The insurance policies are too high. They're higher than the value of the house because they're in such volatile areas. I think the UK is losing 40% of its coastline to erosion. And of course, this summer, the temperatures of the Atlantic have been many degrees at a point where in parts of the ocean, they've been at hot tub temperatures, higher than our bodily temperature, where we can't even step in. These changes are happening faster than we anticipated. Now, that sounds all doom and gloom. It is. And we're going to have to find a way to cope with this information, So we know it's happening. I don't think there's many people out there that deny that the climate vibe is different. I think there are still people that do think that it's not human caused. Whether you think that or not is a moot point. The problem is and they might say, well, this has happened before. Yes. And other animals were made extinct. We're talking about humans this time. So whether you think it's human caused or not, and
it's kind of irrelevant.
It's happening. Slightly irrelevant, yeah. I mean, I think that when you're
debating that, you're missing the point of taking action.
Exactly. So we can. I think George Monbiot, the wonderful, British journalist, he said. Actually, no, it was David Suzuki. He said, we're in a car heading at 100 kilometres an hour to a brick wall, and we're arguing who gets to sit in the front seat. Do you know what I mean? Let's stop talking about blames and all of that kind of thing. We've now got to think about a way to live and a way that could actually save us.
And also, this exploitation of the earth, I feel that we've become so disconnected from Mother Earth in this way that it's this place that we feel like we own or we rent. Do you know what I mean? Rather than seeming like we're interconnected with it and its rhythms and its seasons. And so when people talk about it, I feel that it's viewed as if that's what's suffering. And whilst it is, she'll be fine eventually. Yeah. We're the ones that are toast.
Totally. You're absolutely right. There's a wonderful George Carlin's comedy skit, and I totally recommend people look it up. I've put the link in my book, actually, because it's a YouTube clip from the 1980s. He's a wonderful American comedian. Brilliant. One of the most brilliant stand-up comics who's ever lived. And he does a skit about the climate crisis. And he thinks, I mean, I won't give it away, it's worth watching, but he makes that exact point. The environment, the planet will be fine. Yeah. The planet has been fine without us, for many years.
Like, we're killing the
planet. And we're like a flea. It will just flick off its back, right, when it's had enough of us. And the planet will be fine. We're effed. Can I swear on this?
Yeah, you can.
We're fucked. Quote unquote from George Carlin. Like it's humans that are going to be fucked, and that's what we've got to wake up to. So that was another problem, is using the word the environment movement, right? That's what we all grew up with, is the environment movement. It's going to be about koalas and trees suffering. It's us. We are the sixth extinction event, and we need to wake up to that. I don't like it as being the case. I don't like being the person that talks about it, but the way I try to talk about it is to suggest that the solution isn't about doom and gloom. The solution is actually the very way we want to live, regardless of whether things are falling apart.
Like that would make us happier as individuals, even if none of this
That's
was going
why we're
down.
lonely. We are lonely because we are removed from the way that we know we want to be living.
Which is how?
Which is essentially without being caught up in this the treadmill. The hamster wheel of consuming. We have been numbed into thinking that is the way to live, that the economy, that capitalism, more is the only way.
Yeah,
and
people don't recognise that there's another way, because I guess that information.
It's all we've had.
Yeah,
it's all we've had, and there's been very vested interests, and there's nobody really to point at, because it is a systemic thing. And that makes it hard for the human brain to fathom. We're always looking for someone to point a finger at. And in some ways, it actually makes it easier if we accept no one's to blame here. All we need to do, instead of putting our energy into blaming and worrying and thinking that there's doom and gloom, is to just get off the treadmill, and we have to. And we can either be shoved off it by climate collapse, or we can choose to get off it and actually learn how to live in a way that will make us most resilient and most able to adapt to the new world.
Yeah, because I feel that, there's the personal sovereignty element here, that sometimes people recognise that they can do something and make a difference. But then sometimes people think, oh, well, I can't make a difference to this. This is a huge issue that's beyond me, so I'm just going to put my head in the sand.
And I'm recycling and my neighbour's not, so why should I bother?
Yeah,
that kind of thing.
Just kind of carry on.
That is a huge issue that I get presented with when I have these kinds of conversations. And what I say to that is that we know that governments and industry, big business, needs to make the changes to really shift the dial. We know that, right?
But that comes from consumerism.
Correct.
Behaviour.
Correct.
So it's like, we can look at, like, I don't know, the fast fashion industries and go, oh, they're to blame, they're making money. But it's because people are buying it.
Yeah. And if we shift our spending habits, then they'll have to make changes. And we see that all the time, right? Like in France, they've done all kinds of policies. They've got rid of flights where you can catch a train in less than 2 or 3 hours, I think it is. And they've converted Paris streets, 30% of Paris streets, to cycling and pedestrian lanes. And the city's really happy about it because it's actually reduced pollution, air quality, etc. way more than they expected. And people seeing it. People are going, oh my God, this is a better way to live. So these politicians and business, they are responding to what they see. So that's the power that we have. But I would also say you've got nothing to lose by shifting, because the shift will move you to a place where you are happier because you're not caught up in this treadmill. You're also living in psychological congruence with life, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I want to get into that, because I feel that it's a far more powerful motivation for individuals to go, you're actually going to look better, feel better, be happier, be calmer. Yeah. Like, that's the reality, right?
So I'll rattle off a few examples if you like. So one of the big things that I write about, obviously, because I hiked around the world to tell this story. And it wasn't just because I felt like hiking for a bit, and I love hiking and I've hiked all my life. It's also because these big philosophers and thinkers and poets and scientists that I study to find the big answers to what I'm writing about, they all hiked to get to the bottom of their thinking and the complexity of it all. But equally, there's been 42,000 studies that have been done that look at the way that walking in nature can fix all kinds of things. So it dials down anxiety. It actually gets us more engaged in activation, or and being motivated. It's creative and all of this kind of thing. And in Japan and South Korea, their health policies incorporate walking in nature as a salve. So kids who have ADHD and behavioural problems are shipped out to forests in South Korea before they're put onto ADHD medication. And so a lot of science that shows that walking is actually a really simple way to cut through to a whole heap of things, anxiety problems, health issues, the environment. One of the most effective ways to make a difference is to not own a car. And when you walk, you have this domino effect essentially. So that would be one really great example. Another one would be, for instance, people often say, well, what should I be doing? People do want to think that they're going to be turning the dial, even in their own small way. So people often ask me, what are the 3 things I can do that will actually make a difference from a carbon emissions point of view? The number one thing you can do, and it has so many kind of flow-on effects, is reduce food waste. So if we were to all halve food waste, it would be the equivalent of the world switching to, in terms of carbon emissions, it would save the same amount of emissions as if we all switched to solar and wind. If food waste was a nation, it would be the 3rd biggest carbon emitter after the US and China. So we have that power. And I'm not talking about supermarkets or restaurants. This is consumer food waste only. So the stuff that we buy that we don't eat, or we cook it and we throw the leftovers in the bin rather than reusing it. So that's something that can become really empowering, is when we actually engage in that kind of thing. And it becomes actually, I gamify it, and I share kind of tricks and everything on social media. And
Can you
people love
share
it.
some of the tricks?
Okay. So let me see. Some of it, and I write about this in the book, and people love it because they just think it's super weird, but then they kind of go, I kind of get it. So when I go to a cafe or a restaurant and everybody gets butter either in a little dish or wrapped in foil, and then they don't use it, I collect them all and take them home. I haven't bought butter in about 5 years. So I've got all these little things. And even to the extent where people have half used it, I'll still take it home and I'll use it for cooking, that kind of thing, if I'm worried about germs. Other things that you can do is don't peel things. A lot of the nutrients are in the peel itself. Yeah. Don't ever remove the skin from things like, if you eat chicken and things like that, the enzymes that help you break down the food itself, therefore making it much easier to digest but also less fattening, are contained in the skin. Ditto with milk and dairy products, and this was something that I talked about when I had the I Quit Sugar program, is that the full fat version of things, where you don't remove stuff, is actually more nutritious but also less so-called fattening.
When you say full fat, because one of my best friends, I don't know even where she gets the milk from, but she gets it like straight out of the cow pretty much. And seems, it's silly that seems so extreme. Do you know what I mean? Because of the way that people consume food, it's so detached from its original source. But is that what you mean as an example?
No, just full fat, as in don't buy the skinny diet.
Yeah.
What is it?
All that's crap.
Yeah, it's all bullshit. So if you speak to a pig farmer, I don't know how often you speak to pig farmers, but if they want to, when they want to fatten their pigs, they often get milk from nearby dairies, like the leftovers. If they want to fatten their pigs, they give them skim milk, or
Why?
Yeah, because it's more fattening. When you take the enzyme, which is lactase helps break down the lactose out of it, then your body digests it differently and it becomes more fattening. So anyway, the point is, a lot of these practices, right, that can actually make a difference make sense from a whole range of points of view. It makes you healthy, it saves the planet, it will save you money. So there's a whole range of, like even just walking, that's your exercise. You don't have to join a gym.
Yeah, I actually was watching, there's a new show out around blue zones, and it was so
I worked on the blue zones program.
Did you?
Yeah.
Because just seeing that, I was like, wow, the way they live so harmoniously with nature. And it's these very simple things, like you say, but just walking around the village, having that sense of community, gardening every day.
Observing the Sabbath.
Yeah, but we're just so in the West, we're so disconnected from so much of it.
Dan and I worked a little on that probably 12 years ago when I was first starting out with I Quit Sugar. So I spent a lot of time in Ikaria, which is one of the blue zones, and also Sardinia.
Those were the two that I watched. What was it like actually being there?
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, I mean, for me, Greece is a country where they live out these principles pretty closely and truthfully. And as a result, I looked into the happiness habits and the anxiety levels of a lot of countries around the world and correlated it with a bunch of things, mostly in and around the way that they live closer to nature, but also develop resilience practices as part of their their cultural identity. And Greeks come up very, very highly. Interestingly, and again, I write about this, the Dutch, I don't know if you've ever heard of this kind of ritual called Dutch dropping. It's like the Scout movement. It's where they drop kids in the Dutch wilderness. Now, the Dutch wilderness is not going to be all that wild. It's not going to have mountain peaks and all this kind of thing. But anyway, and these kids, I think every kid in the Netherlands grows up with this, and they've got to find their way home. They've got a weekend to find their way home.
How old are they?
I think these kids are pretty young, like Scouts ages, sort of, 10, 11, 12. So that's part of...
That would not happen in the UK.
No, I know, exactly.
I do think that in the UK it's got particularly bad and sort of mollycoddling children.
Well, that's right. And as a result, if I went and had a look at, so I read about this, and it was a New York Times journalist who'd written about it, and she had a similar response to you, like, what the hell? And she went to the Netherlands and interviewed these parents. And the parents were like, it's fine. They'll get home eventually. It's good for them, kind of thing. Anyway, this is all about building resilience. And we used to have practices which were always, very much about that. And but we don't have them anymore, right? Like it's all about individualism. And of course, mollycoddling is a result of that. So I went and looked it up, and of course the Dutch, I shouldn't say of course, I was happily surprised to see that the Dutch children have one of the lowest rates of childhood anxiety in the EU.
Interesting.
Yeah, and now it's just correlation, but it's an interesting one. So yes, I sort of, in terms of the Greeks and some parts of these various blue zones in the world where people live the longest, in case anyone's wondering what a blue zone is, it's got the most number of centenarians, people who live over the age of 100. The things that they get right are all the things that I'm talking about here. It's about going back to fundamentals. We've made a clusterfuck of everything, and it's because we keep force fitting our sort of human experience into a model that makes no sense, which is the more capitalist, infinite growth on a finite planet mentality. We've been conned into thinking, and I sound like a conspiracy theorist or a wacko when I say this, but I try to stay fairly calm when I say it, but we've been conned into thinking that this is the way we're meant to live, and it doesn't stack up on any measure.
But do you think there's a big sort of campaign going on some aspect that's like, oh, let's keep going in this direction, but create more things that allow us to keep going?
Like green consumption.
Yeah.
Oh, of course. Like the system requires
rather than just
us...
being like, everyone pull back.
The system now, we've got to a point where the system requires us to keep spending to keep the system going, right?
So it's the system that doesn't want to die.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that's nobody's fault because we're all in the system.
Yeah.
But the point is it's going to come to a crash.
It's going to collapse one point or another.
Correct. And so do we want to choose how we're going to exit or, and get off that mad, hamster wheel, or do we want to be shoved off it, And so... And that's a separate consideration, but it's a very valid consideration. So I suppose that's the argument that I try to make, is that we can actually choose a different way of living. And it's not necessarily totally radical or anything. You don't have to go out there and, I don't know, suddenly join a commune or anything like that. There's just simple things. So walking, food waste, not going to the shops. People say to me, how do you live out of a 15 kilo bag for 3 years at a time? Like, what do you do? And I'm like, I don't go to the shops. That's it. That's it.
It's not that.
I know. Like, just don't. And then I gamify it. Like, I've got to buy a new pair of undies, right? So I generally have 4 pairs of underpants. You don't need more than that. And so I often go, they're kind of getting a bit tatty. I should go to the shops and buy more underpants. And I leave it a week and then a month and then 3 months. And then I finally go because, of course, once you go to the shops, shopping begets more shopping, right? Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I gamify it. I find it kind of funny. I feel the freedom of it all. My weekends are free to go hiking, picnics, all this kind of thing.
You realise you don't need it.
You don't need it. That's what happens when you leave it a week, another week, and you start to dread the idea of going to the shops rather than it being your default social activity. So yeah, it doesn't take long to actually find the charm in it and to go, oh my God, I've discovered something that other people haven't caught on to yet. Like, this is fun. This is like a cool way to live.
And then also people, like, even meeting you, like, oh, okay, this is really working for you. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's a beautiful way of living. It's very inspiring, and then that has a sort of domino effect.
So in my book, I tell the story, like I say, we've got to make the new way sexier than the status quo. How do you make a story about the climate collapse sexy? I hiked around the world. So I share all these different hikes, including, there's quite a number in the UK, but there's one that I do from St Ives around to Penzance along the Pirate Trail. It's one of the best hikes I've done, because you go pub to pub and you stay in these tiny little pubs, and so cute. Like, and I had so many adventures along the way and just beautiful
How
things.
long did it take you?
It was only 5 or 6 days. It's a good one. It's actually a really good one if you want to get a bunch of friends together. And I give the details in the book, so you can go and find out the pub that I went to and all this, and this theatre where dolphins were swimming in the background. It's like ridiculous. Anyway, there was a woman who managed one of the pubs I was staying at, and I arrived, and she said to me when I arrived, because she sort of, I said, where's your luggage? And I'm like, this is just it. This is what I've been living out of for 3 years. And she was like, what? Anyway, the story unfolded, and she was asking me all these questions. She was probably about 5 years younger than me. And she was like, you're so lucky. And I said, oh, why is that? And she said, well, that you can afford to do this. And I said, but it's cheaper than paying rent. Like, I don't pay any rent. I don't have a car. I don't get my nails done. Like, my costs are so low. What do you mean? And anyway, we drilled it down, and she was just like, it was really that she didn't feel she had permission to live this way. And I know a lot of people feel that, right?
Well, people think that they have to earn their freedom.
Yes, that's a very good way of putting it.
But then, like you say, they then get caught on this hedonic treadmill where actually it's further and further away.
Correct. And not everybody's going to want to live like I do, and I appreciate that. And in some ways I feel an obligation to live the way I do. Well, no, I don't really. I live this way because
you want to.
I want to, and I'm lazy. I don't want to go shopping. I am always wanting to find ways to ensure that I don't go into that really horrible bipolar panic and unhappiness and dread and suicidal ideation that I've experienced throughout a lot of my life. So I've worked out the mindsets that work
for you. And
I think they're universal. That's the thing.
Yeah. And it doesn't, like you said, it might not look exactly the same for everyone.
Correct.
But if everyone was really honest with themselves, like, the way they're existing probably isn't working for them.
Yeah, and I feel the sadness. I wander around the city here in London, and I can see a lot of sadness and disconnect and a distance from joy. And so, yeah, I think I live this way, and it's not for everyone, but there's ways that people can get closer to these things themselves. So you don't have to go hiking in nature. You don't have to go off to the other side of the world or on some big 6-day trek. The science shows that just 20 minutes walking around a park is enough to get the same benefits, right? And even just the science that shows that the pace of walking goes at the same pace that's perfect for discerning thought, so we think clearly. And so one of the best things you can do is get rid of your car and walk everywhere. You'll get clear thinking, you'll get your exercise done, you'll get experiences of awe. And, there's lots of science that shows how that happens when we're just outdoors a lot. You get your vitamin D, there's just this domino effect, as I say. But yeah, there's other ways also. You can just simply not go to the shops. You can prioritise, as per the blue zones, a Sabbath. I grew up when the shops were closed on a Sunday. And there's parts of the world that still operate that way. And as a result, what do you know? Correlation, they live a long time. So there's a lot to be said for these practices. And we don't have to shake up things too much, and we don't have to wait for society to change. You can choose to have a Sunday with no phones, no shopping, where you and the family go off on a picnic. Yeah. That costs nothing. Walking costs nothing. Meditation costs nothing. Going out into nature costs nothing. We don't have to wait.
I'm curious to know, because you spoke about these philosophers and poets and everyone that you met during this journey. What were some of the discoveries from those thinkers?
Okay, so a funny story. I travelled to Japan. I was actually en route somewhere else, and so I stopped off in Japan. There was this world famous monk who had been referred to and followed, who is an expert in forest bathing or forest therapy, which has become a very big thing, particularly in the States, but also Japan, and it's a Japanese process, but in South Korea as well. As I mentioned, forest bathing is part of the health policy in these countries, and there's parts of America as well that are adopting forest bathing as a legit thing. So anyway, I was off to find this monk who's this world expert on it, and he's a mountain climber. So I eventually hike for 3 days to this remote place. I hike up and meet this dude, and I sit down with him, and we do this big hike up into the mountains. And I said, all right, so, and I have my notebook, forest bathing. And I give him the Japanese word, and he's like, I've never heard of it. And I just laughed my head off. I told him the story of how I'd travelled around the world. I said, you are cited in books as the world expert on this. And he goes, oh, is it this? And I'm like, yeah, that's pretty much. He says, oh, that's just what I do. Anyway, it was very, very funny. But yeah, this idea of he is part of this sort of religious sect, this stems from Buddhism, where they climb mountains. And they practice it for resilience purposes, because when you develop resilience, you can actually conquer a whole range of different things in your life, and also tend to moral formation as well, which is a very big part of what we're talking about here. So that was I suppose an interesting one. I came across all kinds of characters, hiking, different people, random people, tragedies, that walk from Penzance around to St. Ives, this man who was cradling his dog, and he was about to go and put his dog down, and he was crying, and I sat with him for a while. Really beautiful stories of, hiking in Jordan and hanging out with this shepherd. Like a Bedouin shepherd. I hiked across Wadi Rum for 5 days and just slept in with this shepherd, like out under the stars, and he just led me around, and funny things philosophies that he had for life. And so
that must have been incredible.
It was a very enjoyable book to write. At the same time, it was very, very heart-wrenching. It took me down, because I had to find a way to see what's happening in the world as something that was hopeful.
Well, my next question was going to be, what is your hope for this book?
Yeah, my hope really at a fundamental level is to help people feel less lonely, with these thoughts, these fears, these doubts that they're having. At the end of the book, I have this. So part of the book was written during the the COVID lockdowns. And so it also incorporates a lot of stuff around that, around race stuff, everything that's going on in the world. And during that time where I was living, we could do a walk for, 5-kilometre radius or something. And I saw these graffiti posters, and it said, Daddy, what did you do to fight climate change? And you immediately know what that's referring to, right? Down the track, if we're parents and our kid comes to us and things are really bad, and they ask us, what did we do? Did we do everything to save things? Like, it would break my heart if I wasn't able to encourage or inspire as many people as I can, anyone that comes into my orbit, to do everything they can so that when their child comes and asks them that question in maybe 5-10 years, they can have an answer that's adequate. I want to make sure that this book reaches people and they feel that it will help them to do everything they can, you know, so that to save this one wild and precious life, because it is wild and it can be wilder and more fun and more beautiful, and it's definitely precious, you know.
And is there any final sort of piece that you'd like to mention for our audience listening that might have felt a bit fearful about some of these things that we're touching on today, or overwhelmed, like you say, want to just put their head in the sand? Or
Yeah. Well, what I would say to that is that the studies show, and there's a really big sort of movement in around climate anxiety. It's a legit thing, right? And it's a very natural reaction to go into overwhelm. You know, it's our brain, that's just what our brain does. When it can't fight or flee, it goes into a freeze mode. And what gets us out of that freeze mode, because a freeze mode is a very dangerous place to stay in. You know, if you think of a deer being chased by a tiger, right? It can't fight it, eventually can't flee it. So it will often do a collapse response, a freeze response. And it does that so that the tiger chills out, goes, I'll go and get the cubs, we'll come back and have dinner on this deer or whatever. It gives the deer one last chance to save itself. But to save itself, it must jerk itself back online and bolt. Right? And or fight, whatever it might be. And we see mice do it when they're being chased by cats. It's a big part of the evolutionary process. We as humans go into the overwhelm, we freeze, but we don't come out of it. And so one of the most powerful things we can do is to actually jolt ourselves into activation, into engagement and activism. And what they've found is that if you have climate overwhelm, if you engage in climate groups, in whatever it might be, get in your neighbourhood to recycle better, it is actually the best salve for that overwhelm that you're feeling. And I can vouch for that. My anxiety is at the lowest since I've got fully online with climate activism. And climate activism doesn't have to be out there with, you know, Extinction Rebellion. It's about just not shutting yourself down, engaging in the news, reading about it, facing it, and doing everything you can. And everything you can is going to be different for everyone.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining me today. I've absolutely loved this conversation.
Oh, my pleasure. I enjoy talking about it because it's thrilling for me.
Yeah, I can tell. Thank you. One of the things that really struck me from this conversation was how unique Sarah is in recognizing the hedonic treadmill, which I think many of us do, but actually having the courage to get off it in the midst of building a hugely successful business and sticking to her guns. And like I said in the episode, you know, it's whilst we can start out with the best of intention, we can get caught up in the system and become part of it. And I loved that she didn't, that she said, you know, I want to shut down the business and this is what I'm going to do, and has gone on to live this very, I guess, what comes across to me from Sarah is this, you know, value of freedom, and that she lives a life according to the beat of her own drum, and this very minimalist approach, which I think we could all incorporate more of. And whilst it might be quite an extreme version of it, I hope some of the takeaways from this conversation you can incorporate into your own life and see where you can sort of scale back and scale down, because I think we realize that these things, this gluttony of more doesn't actually make anyone happy. So just scaling back a little bit and creating more space and, you know, hopefully more joy. And also the takeaways around climate change. Like, this is a huge thing that we all need to be addressing individually and collectively. And I think Sarah is making amazing steps in helping us, in educating us so that we can take action. So I hope you found this episode inspiring. If you did, please share it with a friend who might find it useful, or share us on Instagram, because I always love hearing your feedback around episodes that resonate with you guys. So as always, thank you for listening, and remember, you are not alone. Goodbye.